There was a time when we were one unified point of consciousness, a singularity that in fractions of a second exploded in a big bang. Since then, life has been evolving exponentially, accelerating. Roughly 2 million years ago, we started using tools and technologies to extend our abilities. As life continues to evolve exponentially, the Two Paths podcast explores the opportunities of modern day tools and technologies as part of our greater becoming. Welcome. Two Paths Podcast is a production of I Am Connected, a digital platform dedicated to the evolution of consciousness. Check us out at iamconnected.com. Today's guest is Rak Razam. Rak is an alchemic storyteller, a documentary filmmaker, author, journalist, and shamanic medicine ambassador. He spent the past 20 years at the intersection of consciousness, spirituality, psychedelics, shamanism, and today we're going to talk all these things and technology and how these things relate to technology. As agents for consciousness, he and I are working to help humanity awaken in a time of exponential technological advancement. We talk about what's most important for us to focus on right now. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. And now an uninterrupted recording of Rak Razam and myself.
I'm excited to talk more about technology in general, and then psychedelics can be part of that, but maybe not the whole psychedelic. It's part. I mean, yeah, we'll get into it, but there's so many emergent disruptive technologies, and they're all a product of our consciousness. So I'm sure we'll have a juicy chat.
Yeah, and that's the opportunity, I guess. Having followed your work for a while, and now I feel grateful for the opportunity to have a conversation with you to talk about. It's almost like we're heading to a convergence point where we've got consciousness, and consciousness is at the center of that, but we've got even like meditation becoming more mainstream, people learning how to disidentify with the internal narrative that we all have. And then you've got emergent technologies and where technology is taking us and the opportunity that can bring, but technology as an extension of our individual, an extension of our collective consciousness. And then you put psychedelics in there as well, and the psychedelics renaissance that's happening and what that does in terms of expanding the perception of who and what we are. I feel like now is a really exciting time to be alive. So I'm stoked to have this conversation with you, man.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Troy. And I'm excited about your topics of conversation. I mean, technology is it's maybe come to mean something more than what it originally means or what we think it means. I mean, it's a product of the mind. And I guess in my career, starting off as an experiential journalist, I was really looking at the domain of the mind, of consciousness itself, and looking at the way indigenous earth and plant medicines, things like ayahuasca and the man-made psychedelics, have affected our consciousness. But in the early days when I was writing, I used to bill myself, I used to freelance for Australian Penthouse and other alternative magazines as consciousness, technology, psychedelics, and there's still the same buzzwords, spirituality, things like that, but they're almost facets of a greater whole, and so we're seeing in the world today such a rapid proliferation of new emergent technologies and disruptive technologies that we've almost lost control. The genie's out of the bottle. So what is technology, and what are we doing with it, or what is it doing with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Like when I consider technology, it's almost like we are some of the most evolved technology on the planet, and when we look at our evolution, evolution of life since the initial Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, until this point here, at the moment, a lot of the technology we're building is really looking into life around us and mimicking that. And we've used tools and technologies in different ways to extend our abilities, for the last a couple of million years. And now we're at this point where our technology is becoming increasingly more sophisticated. So, yeah, I'm excited to look at what that means, historically, through some of the work that you've been doing, and it'd be great to sort of get a little bit of your backstory and understand how what you've done to get to this point, up until this point, as we look at different tools and technologies that can extend our abilities.
Yeah.
So if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about where you started.
Yeah, sure. So basically, it's hard to draw the line, but I started off almost 20 years ago as a freelance journalist. I mean, I'd been in the underground electronic music scene. I used to work for Techno Renegade, a really old school Melbourne-based street level electronic music magazine. And I was into alternative culture, doof parties, what in I guess overseas they call rave culture. But even that is very interesting because it's basically the old tribal trance dance, very much the indigenous sense of community gatherings, altered states, communitas, something bigger than ourselves, but amplified and sort of contained within technology of electronic music and basically the party sort of container. But through that work, I evolved into doing alternative journalism about spirituality, technology, consciousness, and psychedelics. And, in the last 20 years or so, psychedelics specifically have legitimized incredibly. Basically, the money has come in, and the pioneering efforts of many underground or above ground organizations like MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies in the States, and other not-for-profits and for-profits have really helped do the studies on psychedelics as a medicine and bringing them back into the medicinal fold. And now we're seeing basically the world's media really positively promoting the idea of psychedelics as tools for mental health and well-being when used in conjunction with a sort of traditional therapeutic setting. So that's all underway. But back in the old days of around 2005, 2006, these were still underground technologies and utilized by subcultures. And that's always been, I guess, my focus is subcultures and how they exist, what brings them together, what ways they see the world. Because, there's this drive in the last few decades for sort of global monoculture in many ways, not just in like the foods we eat, but the ways we think. And we've really seen in the last 5 or 10 years this proliferation online through social media, and almost like the ecosystem and the evolutionary drives we see in nature are replicating in the digital containers and platforms, where it's become survival of the fittest in the capitalist system. But we see this drive towards essentially a centralization of the players. So as opposed to in the early days of the net, when it started out with a libertarian sort of ethos and a lot of fringe people utilizing the internet and creating their own web pages, and the freedom of information and the camaraderie and the sort of, that cutting edge that was there of community and of everyone supporting each other, and the excitement of that has become commodified and sort of homogenized into sort of social media protocols and mores. And, I was talking to my 11-year-old daughter the other day about the first time I saw Google, like an ad in probably 1999 in St. Kilda Junction in Melbourne, giant banner ad for Google. And you're like, what's that? And now Google's actually a verb, right? It's not only become, a web search engine that is another player amongst many. It's become the Tyrannosaurus Rex, which has killed off all the other sort of, web browsers. I mean, we had the web browser wars back in the 90s, early noughts, and Netscape is dead, and we've had all the GeoCities and, all the players that come and go. But what seems to be happening in an evolutionary drive in the digital sphere is a centralization of market share, and that market share is consciousness. It's the consciousness of billions of people who are all utilizing centralized platforms. So you look at Google, you look at Twitter, you look at Facebook, of course, you look at these platforms and they seem innocuous in the capitalist sense of companies providing a service for their customer base. But if you step out of that and you look at humanity as an evolving organism and the externalization of technology, I really see that we're basically developing digital telepathy. We're getting these externalized modalities which enable us to connect with thousands of people at a time and to get brief little snapshots and maybe they're headline grabs in your feeds. But, you know, the unforeseen consequences of this are that we get the dopamine addictions, we get this centralized narratives of what is the truth, and we're getting cancel culture, and we're getting political machinations by essentially governments in concert with corporations, which is the textbook definition of fascism, to control the flow of information because of the centralization of these platforms. So technology today, as it's always been, if we go all the way back maybe to some of these myths of like Prometheus, right? What did Prometheus do in the Greek myths? He stole fire from the gods, which is a technology, right? The ability to change the way we live through modulating our environment. And so this Promethean technology, which in the legends, the Greek legends, he was punished for by being immortal and having his innards attacked and eaten out by vultures every day again, and healing and going back. There was a punishment of Prometheus to have the hubris to steal a technology from the gods and to give it to man, right? And yet that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing this rapid proliferation of these technologies, which we are almost not ready for. You know, they have these unforeseen consequences, and they're having these unforeseen consequences on our consciousness. And it's not just, you know, in us, it's in our communities. There was, you know, a lot of discourse and a lot of information came out in recent years in regards to, you know, search engines and Google and censorship and a lot of things that have been happening. But we're understanding that, you know, I remember with Facebook, when all those revelations came out about how they were steering and utilizing, the feeds and certain information they would titrate to users, which would affect their emotional status. You know, I got a warning the other day. It said, you've been on Facebook for more than 10 hours. And I was in an airport, you know, I was 28 hours in transit. There was in delays. But it's like they're starting to realize these interfaces of technology are becoming very close and with us and constant partners in our life, and they're having an emotional repercussion on us individually and collectively that is shaping culture. We're getting to this tipping point where the technologies are now so powerful that they're basically starting to censor and curtail them because they're getting out of the box for the powers that be.
Yeah, so there's a lot in what you said there, man. I feel like our technology is an extension of our consciousness. And for me, what that highlights really is how unconscious so many people are, because we are, at the moment, like the power is centralized in the few and the information is being centralized in the few. And if that continues moving forward, that's a very dangerous future, particularly as the technology becomes increasingly more sophisticated. Some of the work that I've done in the past with transformative technologies, for example, is working with entrepreneurs and innovators to build technologies that are human-centered, individual-centered, that help us to evolve. Like, I feel like now more than ever, it's important to help elevate human consciousness so that we don't just unconsciously use these technologies that aren't necessarily serving our well-being. And for me, like, what we looked at in transformative tech is well-being as a spectrum. Is like mental health, where a lot of people are struggling at the moment. And these technologies like Facebook, like Instagram, it promotes like a person's best life. And if you looked at somebody's Instagram feed, you would think that their life is so much better than yours, but it's really not a true indication of how somebody lives. And so these technologies, in the way that they're being used, and like Facebook, like you mentioned, it's really like, as an ad selling machine, it does feed a lot of cognitive bias, so it creates a very narrative perspective of what reality is, even more so than our broader reality. And so, yeah, mental health, it's really not supporting people beyond their mental health. But then, you know, we look at well-being, human performance, human potential, and then what is the potential beyond human? And like, how can we use technology in ways that help us to evolve? And I feel like these, you know, if you look at the top the top 10 market cap companies in the world, or even the top 5, like the Googles, like the Facebooks, like the Amazons, they've got in Microsoft, they've got a responsibility, you would think, unless we change that centralization of power so that it helps the many of us evolve. And like, I'm probably a utopian type person, but I feel like it's like we're at this really important conjuncture point as we move into an even more digital realm, as we move into like the virtual worlds. And that's something like the metaverse, as we start creating worlds within worlds within worlds. Like, it's imperative that us, not just as an individual human, but as a human race, as human beings, as human becomings, as a collective, that this be considered. And so, like, for me, like, this is why I'm excited by the psychedelic renaissance. These tools are becoming more and more mainstream, and I feel like you mentioned the journalism, like journalists are picking up and now professing the benefits of it, but that's based on a lot of research from organizations like MAPS, like organizations like the Imperial College in London. Like, there's a lot of people that have been doing profound work in the background to help legitimize these really powerful tools, these powerful medicines. And so as this convergence points comes together, it's like, what like, I'd love to drop in on some of the like research that you've done and what you've sort of explored around like psychedelics, maybe just initially, as a tool that helps to expand a person's perception of who they are. Because I know for me, like, growing up, I grew up with an innate sense of suffering, and through my teenage years, I experimented with different illicit drugs. But a lot of them, what they did is help create another perception of who I wasn't then stuck in the same patterns of thinking. It showed myself from a whole different point of view, which was very liberating for me personally. And I'm just wondering what your experience has been with psychedelics and as a tool for expanding consciousness. Does it do that, or what have you seen?
All right, so I'd just like to contextualize that by saying, yeah, I guess the focus of our talk here is technology, and people might be like, oh, what are they talking about psychedelics for? So what we're positing is psychedelics are a technology, right? And, first I think we need to step back, and we've used this word consciousness. And I presume we all think we know what consciousness is, but really no one knows what consciousness is, right? There's an elephant in the room there. So one of the classic definitions I like to use about consciousness comes from Alfred North Whitehead, who was a early 20th century, late 19th century philosopher. And he just said really simply, consciousness is the apperception of pattern as such, or the awareness of awareness, right? So there's different levels of consciousness. And we might say from a more mechanistic point of view, in a Western paradigm, that humans are consciousness, animals are sort of consciousness, but not as conscious as us because they're not self-reflexive. Although I think that is probably not true, and probably more of an ethical, moral blindfold we put on ourselves because of the way we treat animals and use them as a resource. And then we come to the plant kingdom, and we might say, yeah, plants aren't conscious. Humans are conscious. Plants are just plants, right? Although there is a lot of science happening at the moment. There's a New York Times best-selling book called Thus Spoke the Plant by Dr. Monica Gagliano, who lives here in the Northern Rivers in Australia. And she is a scientist that had been looking and doing experiments on plant consciousness. And basically, she believes that plants are conscious and they can communicate. They communicate with each other in the root systems, in the exchange of nutrients and things like that. But what we're talking about is levels of consciousness, gradations of consciousness. And that what is consciousness? We think that consciousness, science basically says there's two possibilities for how consciousness manifests in the world. That basically the organism, and in the human organism, we obviously have the body and the brain, and that the brain somehow produces consciousness when the vessel of the body is grown and has the capacity. The consciousness is locked into the being, and that's it. We all have consciousness, but it's something in us and in you and in everyone, but it doesn't exist in the spaces between you and I. It's just in us, in the receivers we have or created within the body. That's one view. The view that many other people, including Aldous Huxley, who's a famous author and essayist and philosopher from the 20th century, he wrote the book Heaven and Hell and the Doors of Perception based on his mescaline experiences. He also wrote Brave New World and other seminal texts and was very spiritual. So his understanding was that basically the human organism and the brain is like the mind, is like a filter or a reducing valve for what he called the mind at large and what you say consciousness at large. And that the other equally valid and I think more valid understanding of what consciousness could be is a phenomena which is broadcast. So, the old analogy was that if you have a radio and you're getting a signal and you're hearing the radio program and you destroy the radio, well, the signal is still being broadcast. They've updated that to a TV, and my take on that now is it's almost like a BitTorrent, right? Is that if consciousness is being broadcast and that the human organism and the plants and the animals and the forms are like base stations who are receiving that broadcast consciousness signal. And according to the peculiarities of your particular form, you will get different levels of consciousness. But consciousness is something which exists beyond the organism. It is a fundamental principle of nature and of reality itself. Of course, that brings up questions of where does consciousness broadcast from? Who's broadcasting consciousness? And perhaps the way to understand those answers is to experientially explore your own consciousness, which is where things like psychedelics come in. So,
if I can just jump in.
Yeah.
So just jump in for a sec. I think you're right. Like, no one really knows. Well, the science can't tell us if consciousness arises from the human as a construct of the brain, mind, or like there's also other interesting work. I know a researcher, I read his book, A Case Against Reality, Donald Hoffman. He talks about, he's basically looking in the place, whilst a lot of scientists, neuroscientists are looking for consciousness as it arises from the brain, he's looking in, well, consciousness is the underlying fabric of everything. So even more so ingrained than something that's emitting consciousness is everything. Essentially, we are consciousness. So it's not like if a plant is conscious, it's like everything is consciousness. Everything is ultimately made of the same construct or energy and rises and takes different form. And I guess we're just at an evolutionary point where we're able to realize that. But it's all theory at this stage. So it's just interesting to have that conversation as well. Well, what is consciousness?
Yeah, and to bring this back, so, I mean, the idea that consciousness is something which is broadcast and it continues beyond the physical form. It's just that you need the physical form to be self-aware, which is that definition of self-aware consciousness. But this opens up the idea then that, it's very close to the animist and the indigenous understandings of the world, that in their understanding, essentially, the entire fabric of nature is conscious and has a consciousness and can be communicated with. So I first went down to, as I said at the start, I was, probably around 2004, 2005, I started freelancing in these fields and writing about consciousness, spirituality, technology, psychedelics. I first went to Albert Hofmann's 100th birthday party, the chemist who discovered LSD, and was writing about psychedelic culture in 2006 for a lot of Australian newspapers and magazines. And then I went down to the Amazon for the first time in mid-2006 to attend the second Amazonian Shaman Conference, and to really unpack this idea of the archetype of the shaman and ayahuasca, and understanding what this great plant medicine of ayahuasca, which is native to South America and was increasingly at that time becoming into my awareness, and has since really taken over the world. But this idea, again, we have to step back, because plant medicines can be considered a technology of consciousness. And in indigenous communities, what we now know is that, the archetype of the shaman is something which was literally invented by Western anthropologist, by Mircea Eliade in his book Shamanism in the 1950s. Medicine people, men and women, are all around the world. They play many roles. You could say they're a doctor, a priest, sometimes a political or a chief of the village, but they're mediators of the energy and the well-being of their communities. And they have their own language and their own terms for these medicine men and women. But essentially, they're the bridges between the plants and animal world and the human tribes and the higher dimensionality which they believe exists beyond the physical form. And so Western science is in many ways catching up with a lot of these ideas, but paralleling very closely these indigenous understandings and a lot of the Eastern mysticism as well. They're just different languages, but they're the same geographies that they're exploring. So consciousness in these indigenous understandings extends to the plant and other worlds, and that certain plants we take affect our consciousness and our technologies. So in the Amazonian tradition, I worked with and learnt from the Amazonian curanderos. It's from the Spanish, it means to cure or to heal. And they are many different professions and sort of delineations. There's a curandero means to heal, but there might be vegetalistas, which work with a multiplicity of plants for healing of their patients. There might be ayahuasqueros that work specifically with ayahuasca, the great vegetal medicine of the Amazon, which is hallucinogenic and can be very visionary as well as healing. There might be tabaqueros and other sort of specialities. But in a sense, they're their own practitioners of the science of curanderismo, the science of healing. And these are technologies of the sacred. And I think we have a conceit, especially in the West, where, let's say for the last 500 years, the new world went back to the old world 500 years ago as the empires were building and, all of that, and basically subjugated and eradicated much of the old world and their indigenous populations and of their wisdom teachings. And the new world, the Western world, really wasn't ready for this idea of plant medicines as technologies, right? And so we still have this disconnect where, even though there's a psychedelic renaissance happening now and a global shamanic resurgence and people are using these psychoactive substances, it's very rare that people would define them as technologies, but they are. They're technologies of the sacred and technologies of the planet. So at the moment we have a modern wave where, for 500 years we had a disconnect. In the West, we killed our witches and warlocks and herbalists and our medicine people for whatever reasons, and essentially it was political and religious, and there was a whole lot of repression and dogmas and control mechanisms of culture. But we extinguished the substances which would heal and help us reconnect to ourselves and to the planet, and these technologies fell out of use. And so, it's created a vacuum within which, in the last, less than a century, basically, William Burroughs, the famous beat sort of writer, and William Burroughs, how do you describe him? He went down to the Amazon in the 1950s in search of ayahuasca, or a version of it called yahe, which was used in Ecuador and still used at this day. And since the 1950s onwards, there's been a slow appreciation of very outliers who would be out there looking to explore this thing, but it's been the underground of the underground. But from the 1980s, 90s on, there's been an emergence of Westerners going down to Peru and South America, working with ayahuasca, which over the last generation or two has now entrenched into a lodge system and a retreat sort of scenario where, it's easy to plug and play and you research online and go down and work with plant medicines, including ayahuasca or San Pedro or the many different types of medicines there are, which are technologies to explore your consciousness and to heal and to work with that. So that's what I've been involved with predominantly for the last 15 years is I made a documentary in ayahuasca. It's called Aya Awakenings. And there was a book that came before the documentary. And then I've made another show called shamansoftheglobalvillage.com. You can find it, which is looking at other earth medicines of psychoactive nature and looking at the role of the caretakers of these technicians of the sacred to expand consciousness and to help heal.
So why do you think that we're seeing this resurgence now where people are looking for these opportunities to explore consciousness. And do you think this work is important now and leading into the future? Like, what's your take?
There's not going to be a future unless we improve the individual and the society. And so, as I said, there's been a historical drift over 500 plus years. And again, this comes back to our originating sort of conversation here about what is consciousness. So at the root of modern consciousness is something we haven't mentioned, which is the ego. And the ego, it comes from the Latin. It just means the sense of I, right? Before Freud, in like the 1920s or 30s, this term ego wasn't really pronounced. And, you know, as psychotherapy and all of that has in mid 20th century taken off, it's really become more of a dominant idea and a meme. But essentially, you know, this is critical for psychedelics and plant medicines as well, is what is this sense of ego? So I've been working with plant medicines for over 20 years. I actually facilitate and work with 5-MeO-DMT in Mexico and countries where this is legal. And so I have a lot of experience with this, and it's a very deep experience. But in terms of the mind itself, we're not what we think we are, or you could say we're bigger than we think we are. And when a baby is born, it's essentially a distributed consciousness. You know, it's like you see babies and they're like, it's like there's no separation between their experience of what they're experiencing and them, because they don't have this filter of what we call the ego. They have a mind, they're aware, they're getting sensory information, they're feeling, you know, but they don't have a centralized ego. And so this is crucially important to understand what consciousness is and how we're creating more technologies through the egoic consciousness filter that we have, and why this may be an issue and a problem, right? And so the ego develops at a very early age, but in Western culture, we glorify and we reward and we bootstrap and we have bastardized the normal egoic process. So this may be jumping around a bit, but I'm trying to get clear on this. My understanding from a lot of shamanic work that I've done and from intuitions and from looking at this very deeply over time, and you can look at a lot of my writings on rakrazam.com, and I've got a lot of interviews and a lot of free information out there on consciousness and psychedelics. And you can't really talk about any of this without talking about it in a holistic, whole systems way. I've got a friend, Daniel Pinchbeck, who's another commentator and writer on psychedelic and consciousness issues. And he did a post the other day that I really perfectly nailed it, is that, you know, back in the 60s, people used to say, oh, hippies, it's all trippy. It's all the language they're using to describe their psychedelic experiences. It had a dissonant effect. It had a dissonance where mainstream people couldn't understand it because the concepts themselves were outside the mechanistic, reductionist, linear consciousness that white picket fence reality really promoted and rewarded. But the thing is, really, it's about holistic. It's about understanding who and what you are and what you're embedded in. Consciousness is broadcast. You know, life is created. These vehicles that we're in are here, but we don't really understand who and what we are. But you have to come back to this understanding of holistic reality. So somehow this world exists. And you mentioned the Big Bang at the start. Well, they've just revised that. And you look it up right now, look at all the scientific papers. They now believe there was something before the Big Bang. So we're back to square one with that one. But essentially, we're born and we have this mind, right? And so the mind is like an iceberg with 9/10 under the surface. But on the surface, we have this ego mind. We also have the brain. We have the heart, which has 90% neuronal cells just like the brain and thinks and feels and has thoughts of its own. And we have the gut instinct down in the belly. And basically, they say we have a thought about a third of a second before we consciously recognize we've had a thought, but it doesn't come from the head brain. It comes from the gut instinct, right? The gut has 7 trillion microorganisms that go into gamma consciousness, which is a sense of unity. And all these microorganisms are necessary to break down certain foods. And they have a collective intelligence of bacteria and microorganisms that aren't us. They're not the physical body we think we are when we think that I'm an I. But they are fundamental to who we are, and they have thoughts that then go up into our head brain. And cravings and desires and other motivating sort of, things. But what I'm getting at is we have 3 brains that we know of. And all of that is part of our consciousness, which is affecting the tools and what we do with it. The ego is essentially, in my understanding and my intuitive feeling, and this can't technically be proved, but we know that we look at a baby and they're undifferentiated in their consciousness before they come into egoic consciousness. We have stories and legends and reports from Indigenous people all across the world, including here in Australia with the Australian Aboriginals, who say we had a dreamtime consciousness. We've had stages of human evolution where we believe that we have different levels of consciousness than what we have now. And we've also had, over very large tracts of time, regular planetary disasters that basically modulate the species here on Earth, all the time. And so we have boom and bust in civilizations and in humanity and other species. And in those bust times, we have trauma. And I believe that the current state of the ego in the human organism and human culture is only 12,800 years old. It sounds ridiculous. And, they're finding more and more evidence of ancient civilizations and of technologies and of states of consciousness that primitive people couldn't have had, right? That go back 50, 100,000, 200,000 or more time. But in those world ages and those cycles of time, consciousness itself has fluctuated. So the current consciousness we have now is dominated by the ego. And it feels to me that ego is a trauma response, that we have species PTSD from a climactic event we had 12,800 years ago called the Lower Dryas Extinction Event, which initiated another mini ice age and basically wiped out humanity. And we started again, and we fell into agriculture, and we started to distance ourselves from nature and the planet, and we started to come into villages and towns and cities and boxes, and we start to separate from nature and from the connection to nature. And so that egoic consciousness started to create technologies like agriculture, like the wheel, like fire. But each technology we've created has been from the filter of this egoic consciousness, which is wounded and separated from the holistic connection and understanding and reciprocation of the mind of nature. And so this is a fundamental starting point to talk about technologies, because unless we understand there's an invisible filter in understanding how we're creating technologies or what technologies are, they're externalizations of our consciousness. And evolution, or genetic evolution in the way we've evolved, has 2 things. We have exosomatic evolution and endosomatic evolution. Basically, we can evolve internally, and we've stopped evolving genetically in the last 50,000 years or so. It could be it's not a coincidence, but it seems like we have externalized that internal genetic evolution into our technologies on the outside. So when we start to use fire and we cook food, then our teeth and our digestion will change because the food is no longer raw. When we start to make a wheel and we start to, create vehicles or ride horses or do things like that, well, then our legs and our bodies will stop because they're not evolving. We forget that we are a technology, but we've externalized our evolutionary surge of how that technology is utilized to these products that we create from our minds and externalize outside of ourselves. And then we call those things technologies, essentially. And then, but we need to step back and understand all of these technologies and exteriorization of our life energy force, but it's filtered through the ego, which is itself separated from the planet. So that's probably why when we get to things like psychedelics and earth medicines and shamanic medicines, that we don't even think of those as technologies. They're substances, they're things that we take. But even if we step back another level, the planet, which, we could use the term Gaia, which James Lovelock, who was worked for NASA and was a whole systems scientist who just died recently, and an environmentalist, he basically, encapsulated this idea that the planet is a living organism and it is a technology, right? And he called it Gaia. It's a whole system which modulates its species and exchanges energy, and life itself is a mechanism for growing consciousness. So all of this is a technology at the root system of the cultural, social technologies which we see being implemented in the world today.
Yeah, there's a lot in that, man. Like, I appreciate what you're saying about creating technology from the ego mind, and maybe that's what we see, such centralization in power today. Like, individuals that have learned to use the system to create the technologies that we see today have centralized that. And I know in my experience, I was fortunate enough when I was in the US to have a 5-MeO experience. And I think it's not just 5-MeO, but one of the profound experiences of having a psychedelics journey is that dissolution of the ego, and then the feeling of connection to the greater all, so to speak. And it does sort of strip away the veil that the ego creates in separation, which I think is really important as we move forward in terms of building technologies. And if we continue, like you suggest, to build technology from an ego-based space of consciousness, or an ego-based consciousness, well, then that's going to be a whole different future, because then we are separate, and then there is a you versus me. There is a very clear distinction. But as we have more and more experiences with tools, like you suggested, like psychedelics as a tool, but not just tools, but meditation. In my experience, I've been meditating for 20 years now, and for me, it was the single most powerful thing to help me realize who I was in the world, and to learn how to build a healthy relationship with the ego, with the mind. And so for me, my experience is not so much making the ego an enemy or the ego a bad, but it's learning how to have the ego in its place and building a healthy relationship with it, and learning in my experience, building a connection, like basing my innate sense of being not in the ego, but knowing that I am actually part of a whole. And I appreciate your take on like how and when the ego, I hadn't heard that before, 12,500 years ago. At that point, there was that event, and then from there we went into villages and so forth. That's an interesting theory. I've also considered that, like the Big Bang. You mentioned there was something before the Big Bang. That's interesting. I've heard theories that at the center of a black hole is another Big Bang on the other side. Again, it's just a theory. However, like the beginning of a new universe from a universe, there was that point of that singularity where we all were one unified point of, consciousness, or everything that exploded into separation. So potentially we've been in separation since that point. But I do know in my experience is that what a lot of people are craving is, we say happiness, but it's not even really happiness. It's really wholeness. It's that connection that we feel that I'm enough. I am whole. I don't need to add anything to myself because I'm connected. And in the work that I do with I'm Connected, we essentially are teaching people how to feel that energy again, to feel that underlying life force that's all around us, because to some extent we've stopped feeling, we've lost our ability to be able to feel the energy that we're all part of. And that's largely, like you mentioned, trauma before, like we're the ego being traumatized, and we haven't been taught how to express emotions effectively. We live in a society that doesn't support the public displays of emotion. As a guy, we get taught to suppress our emotions, to not be, weak, and in doing so, we suppress these peak emotional experiences that we have, and so we don't feel them. And so it almost like, it's, in my experience, it's creating a block, because what we're learning to do is feel those in a safe environment, feel those peak emotions that we weren't able to feel. And then when we do that, on the other side of that is what we're looking for, is that wholeness. And so as we look at technologies, like, I agree, like psychedelics are a tool and a technology to help show us we are more than that egoic mind. Meditation is a tool in the same right. And I appreciate like the importance of this work now more than ever as we move into increasingly more sophisticated technologies, and at a time where the rate of acceleration for technology is going to increase. I also love what you were saying about how we have externalized our evolution, because we haven't evolved, we've been in this Homo sapien form, but we've kind of stopped. So that's an interesting point. And I totally appreciate what you're saying about having three brains. And when part of some of the work that we do is like with the guys in our courses is just have them look at what's actually happening inside a cell and the sophistication. And there's so much going on. Like when you look at like molecular machinery type videos, there's so much happening just inside a single cell, inside a single cell that we are like not consciously aware of. Are we actually doing that? Well, not. No, it's like we're in this body. We get to use this body, but we actually like, are we the body? So yeah, we're at this really exciting preface point. And so ego, yeah, for me, it's not
right.
so much
just
about.
to pick up on what you said, like there's an acceleration. I mean, I think we all feel it in the world at the moment, and to a large degree, it is caused by the disruptive and emergent technologies. So, if we go all the way back, the invention of fire changes the way we interact with nature, changes our survival sort of strategies. The wheel enables us to build, civilization. So each technology enables these, jumps in our potential. But each one now is getting so fast because there's so many and they're all interpenetrating and they're exponentially, driving forward. There's a paradigm or a movement called transhumanism, which basically sort of started in the late 80s, early 90s, and some sci-fi writers were involved with. But a lot of the tech industry is involved in it now. But, they have this idea that perhaps this exponential drive and acceleration of technologies is altering the human form and the human capacity, and that we could be at this tipping point where we become transhuman or more than human, of the biological human and what is possible. And they get into a lot of really esoteric nerdism about, like uploading our consciousness to robot bodies or into the cloud, or immortality, living forever, or, things that go beyond the biological. And, there's an equal and opposite reaction to that, where a lot of people feel like that's fantasy, or not even just fantasy, because it might be technologically possible. But again, it comes down to, what are we? What are we doing here? And are we meant to actually get out of our bodies? I mean, Elon Musk is, the great Tony Stark of our time, and he's led the way with so many endeavors. But one of his things at the moment is Neuralink. And Neuralink is the idea that, he can put a chip in your head. It can connect you to greater capabilities. Maybe it's almost like we're becoming computerized. In a sense, it's like Star Trek with the Borg, where we are merging with our machines. And again, we have to understand the machines and the computers are an externalization of us and our technology, but they seem to lack the humanity, because they don't have a biological form. They don't feel, right? And we're not just our minds. Again, we have a mind, which we don't even really know what that is, but we think it's from the brain. But again, we have the heart brain, we have the gut instinct. The gut instinct means we're a colony organism. We're made up of all these beings. We think we're just I, but we're actually more than we think we are. So then to project that on to, some of these emerging technologies like AI or artificial intelligence and computers, and where that's all going, is we have to be very careful, because we don't understand ourselves and what consciousness is. And yet we have the hubris to try to build artificial consciousnesses. And, you know, what is an artificial consciousness? Unless it has a critical mass of all the components of what we have, it might not be healthy. So in a lot of the science fiction, we have these examples of almost like, you know, robot AI zombies, where we have, my shorthand for this is like in Terminator, where there's like, you know, the robot AIs take over, or like in Matrix like that. But in Terminator, they had this thing of Skynet. Skynet went online in 2022, actually, back in the 80s when Terminator first came out. And Skynet was basically like an autonomous AI that basically took over the world. And my feeling is we're either going to have a Skynet or a GodNet, in the sense of this march towards a centralization and a new platform, a new level of control that comes from the chaos of all these emerging technologies all pooling together. It seems to be that things are coming to a focal point, which in the transhuman movement they call the singularity. And the singularity is meant to hit by about 2032. And they've done this in a very mechanistic, scientific way, you could say. They're looking at all the emerging technologies and where they might go in 2 years, 4 years, 8 years, 12 years. And they can see that like the processing power on a computer chip, it gets to a certain threshold, it's called Moore's law. And then it gets to a thing where it can't go any further. But then they figure out they can make quantum computing. And then, as opposed to getting all the transistors on a physical chip, they can somehow invent like quantum computing, which works with 2 photons of light, which then maximizes your memory capacity, you know, quintillions. Basically, every time they hit an upper threshold, they figure out a way that there is no threshold. And again, this is our consciousness interfacing with the externalization of our consciousness, which are the technologies. And what we're getting deeper and deeper into is the fabric of reality itself. And, you know, we can do look at the James Webb telescope that can look out into the stars and magnify the galaxies, and we can see at, you know, unprecedented detail. And what we're seeing, of course, are these structures of galaxies within the universal system, which have replicating structure on the micro and macro level. So the swirl of a galaxy arm and the swirl of, the Fibonacci sequence, which is the way things work in nature, it's as above, so below. The same patterns are in nature on the smaller scale to the larger scale. So one of the current theories is that, you know, we know from NASA, the center of our galaxy is a black hole. And they're thinking that, you know, the center of every galaxy has a black hole, and perhaps the center of every atom is a black hole. And what they are in fact singularity points beyond which we don't know. But, there seems to be this pattern on different scales of reality, and our technologies are enabling us to see that, whether that's on the galaxy level or on the micro level or the quantum level, right? But more and more we're seeing underneath the fabric of things, which is not physical, with our technologies, externalization, more than we can see with our eyes, with our externalized technologies, we're peering into the fabric of reality itself. This is godlike power, right? But it's the same monkeys which set off the atomic bomb back in 45, are warring all across the planet, have contributed dynamically to the breakdown of the environment and runaway global warming, have basically, through our technologies, through the limited consciousness we've had, have set in motion a chain of events which is either going to kill us or imminently liberate us. And it's really accelerating. And this is the important thing to think about, not just the individual technologies, but the domino effect of consciousness itself, which has set in motion the technological arms race that we have at the moment. So
I appreciate what you're saying, man. And I think the pertinent point you made earlier is like relevant to the ego mind and the importance of us to take a step back from that. And that's where other technologies like psychedelic medicines come in, like meditation come in, to actually help us to appreciate that we aren't just the ego mind. I'm interested in your point of view of like, because I agree, I heard it was 2045 for the singularity. I find this all very exciting. As we work towards building the metaverse, which I understand is years away, the technological capabilities aren't here yet, but as we work towards building this metaverse and we start creating worlds within worlds in the digital space, something interesting, like Elon Musk was asked, like, are we in a simulation today? And when we look at our biology, one of the things that really I'm curious about that fascinates me is how our brain can't tell the difference between this reality and a virtual world. So much so that nature, evolution, had to evolve like an ability like muscle atonia. So when we dream, it paralyzes our body. Otherwise, we'd be acting out our dreams. Like, why is that? Why is it our brain can't tell the difference between what is a virtual world and what is the real world? Which begs the question that maybe we are actually in a highly advanced simulation right now. And this here is the highly advanced technology, the organic virtual reality kit and the haptic suit that enable us to experience this reality. And then as we go to build these digital worlds, it's not unlike what you said before, as above, same as below, like a worlds within worlds within worlds within worlds to infinity. I'm interested in your point of view on that.
So, Elon's just, he didn't invent the term simulation. It's this idea that what is a simulation? Every originating culture has a mythology or a map or a story around what it is that we're in and why we're here, right? But, you could use terms like samsara or, which is like this illusion or maya, lila, all these Eastern, cultures which had originally, entheogens or psychedelic compounds at their root, the soma of antiquity, but then also developed intricate maps of consciousness from that relationship with the catalyst of their psychoactive medicine. And so as part of that, they understood that this world seems to be not the only world, right? And so even in quantum physics now, David Bohm, who is a famous quantum physicist, coined these fundamental terms, the implicate and the explicate, right? It's pretty simple, but it's basically saying there's an originating source, which is the originating source code of what has produced everything, and it projects out of itself the creation. And that's just another world myth. All these cultures have different words for it. But they basically have all been saying what we're in isn't the be-all and end-all. It's a frequency we're in, a platform, a container, but there are other worlds. In the shamanic paradigm, they would say we have the earth world, we have an above world, and a below world, or they might gradiate the water world, the sky world, the underworld, and modern 20th century anthropology looked at all of these cultures as primitive and noble savages or whatever, but actually they had very robust paradigms and cosmologies, right? It's just that we didn't believe them. And now through, our externalized technology, which is again the mind, they are coming to the same conclusions. So when we say the simulation, it's like the pixel resolution. Now we know we can create virtual worlds with our technologies. And we can inhabit virtual worlds with our technologies. And within a generation, if we had a generation and the world wasn't in runaway global warming and we're at this crisis of survival itself, the technology would get to a point where it would be internalized again. Remember how we said exosomatic and like internalized? And so we've externalized for 50,000 years or more our technology, so we're not genetically evolving so fast. And it's doing that so it can happen faster and faster and faster and faster. And then it gets to this tipping point or this crescendo, which is a singularity where it's like, it's got to this thing where the technology becomes a force of itself. And we can now create virtual worlds. And it's just a matter of pixel resolution and interfaces where we can now have very primitive, as you said, haptic technologies, haptic suits. We can feel touch. If we can replicate all 5 senses virtually, what is the difference if the resolution is good enough? Well, there's good and bad to this, because essentially what we're saying is we can build a matrix, just like the Matrix movies, but your physical body still has to be somewhere and looked after. But all the sci-fi that's explored this has pretty much been dystopias. I can't think of a positive sci-fi which is where this could go, which turns out right? Because actually we have a beautiful world out there that we're not nurturing and we're not looking after. If it is a simulation, why aren't we inhabiting it and living in the simulation in a way which is integral? But no, we're avoiding it still. We're in the ego and we're in trauma, and we are still avoiding our relationship with the world, whether it's a simulation or real, whichever language you give to it. And we're still going from, the same linear progression from the jungles and the savannas of Africa to the villages and the towns and the cities. And now we're going inwards. The same journey of trauma, I believe, is the driver, which is removing us further and further from the reality of this paradigm of the world, which may be a simulation in itself. But there's a qualitative, textual energy which can be felt from this simulation, which we have not achieved in our virtual simulations yet. We can feel, we can be nurtured, we can taste water, we can eat food, we can absorb the sunlight. We haven't got to that with the virtual worlds. And of course, the virtual worlds are simulations of simulations. Remember the old analogy of a photocopier in the old days? You take a piece of paper with a message on it, you'd photocopy it, but then if you photocopy the photocopy and then photocopy the photocopy, it degrades and it erodes over time. And so the quality you're getting isn't the real deal. This reality we inhabit is the real deal. And there are other realities that this reality is embedded in, which psychedelics and shamanic medicines and the right training and context and lineage and support can introduce you to, that are hyper real, that are more real than this reality. The indigenous communities of Peru, the Shipibo, Conobo, ayahuasca tribes, they believe that the ayahuasca world, the visions you see on ayahuasca, is the originating world. Again, you could say the implicate, from which this world is the projection of. Many cultures believe that. So this is important to realize as well. We are Russian dolled, embedded within embedded, realities within realities, according to the majority of indigenous cultures that have lived on this earth for all time. It's only the Western egoic conceit, which is like, nah, this is it. We're cool, mate. And, and here we are spending our time to create a more virtual reality, which again, with the current system, will be built by capitalism for capitalism and will be a pay-per-view where you will be by 2030, you will own nothing and you will be happy and you'll be living in your virtual haptic suit, probably, in your little cubicle that'll be allocated to you. And you might be in this beautiful virtual world, but when the credits run out, so does your world, right? And meanwhile, your body still needs to get nurtured and be drip fed in your matrix pod, owned by the corporations who own you, because you no longer engage with the real world and you are living in a world owned by the capitalist overlords. This is the danger that, again, the technologies are embedded in a cultural ideology which is wounded and it doesn't understand who and what we really are.
I appreciate your thoughts, man. A couple of things come up for me, and it's the importance of this emergence around Web3, right? The decentralization of power. The other thing that came up for me was like the photocopier analogy. We do everything digitally online now. We don't have photocopiers because we've moved beyond that technology. And I feel like where are we limiting ourselves and what is truly possible in an infinite world by hanging on to the old concepts of who and what we were. Like if we were still trying to improve the photocopier, like there comes a point where we move beyond the photocopier. And so as our technology evolves, and I feel like even the opportunity with machine learning and artificial intelligence is to have massive links in what it means to be us, what it means who and what we are, but it needs to be pointed in the right direction, not in a world where we're just existing in these little booths, getting our little feed. That's not an existence. Like for me, like a utopian future is like, well, maybe we need to let go of the concept of who and what we are, and how do we point technology in a direction that can show us a future that we can't even perceive now because the mind is a limitation for what is ultimately possible. And that's what excites me.
Okay, but here's the thing. So let's look at some of the current crop of technologies which are pretty revolutionary and are really coming through all the time. in the last month in my feeds, and I'm a Facebook addict, I'm all over it, I hate it, but it's like, but has anyone noticed this drive, this thrust of AI art, that basically there's like about, a dozen platforms that have emerged seemingly overnight out of nowhere, or it's got to a critical mass where all our contemporaries are all going, oh shit, have you checked out this AI art? You type in some keywords and it comes up with this incredible, beautiful, surrealistic, painted or different textures. Basically, the AIs have got to the level now where they've analyzed all the art in the world and they can replicate it. So what does this mean? So we go, oh, great. What a great liberating technology for humankind. Anyone can make art now. It seems really great on the surface, but what's happening? The artist is gone. The artist is dead. But not only the artist in everyone, the quality of engaging with your consciousness and your experience of life, of making art, not the product, but the feeling capacity of what's happening in your consciousness and brain is you're occupying your creativity, your imagination, which is a quality of consciousness which engages with the untapped potential of reality and brings in something new. That's being neutered. And all you're doing is typing in a keyword, and the computer's doing all the shaping. It's doing all the tactile engagement with art. It's doing all that. And so, my daughter did some AI art the other day, and she's been painting. And then it's like, oh, great. I see her, when you're painting, like stick your tongue out and you're being all creative and your whole being is creating something. And now you put in some keystrokes and there's AI art. Humans are being taken out of the engagement of life. So we no longer make art. The AIs will produce art for it. Oh, what do you feel like today? Oh, I want to see a flower. Oh, here it is. Oh, that's nice. It's another little hit. But we're not actually engaging with using our technologies to make us better human beings. We're seeing it all across the board. The driverless cars, you no longer have to drive a car. Oh, seems great. But now you can't drive where the car won't take you. You can't drive if the car gets hacked. If your social credit score goes down in Planet Orwell in the near-term future, you won't be allowed in the car. It's like, and also I love driving. I love driving because it's like I tune out and I get to sort of daydream and I go into like this creative state where I'm driving, I've got a purpose, and I'm going through my landscape. But it's like that's going to be taken away in the near-term future, right? I mean, all of these things. I mean, we look at some other emerging technologies like CRISPR, genetic modification. So again, it's like, oh, this seems okay. It was like we can take out we can fuse your telomeres together at the end of your DNA and maybe you'll live forever. Or we can take out that gene which was going to kill you. Or we can do whatever. It's like, yeah. And, they may have mapped the genome to one degree of sort of a level of awareness, but you look at genetically modified foods and there's arguments on both sides here, but it's a few generations in and we don't know the ramifications of seizing control of nature and through biomimicry, copying it, but not understanding the intricate root system of what the ramifications will be. So a lot of people are still opposed to GM foods because if they cut out certain things, the flow-through effect can really affect our life and our nurturing. Same with CRISPR. It's like, that doctor in China that got disbarred, but obviously the Chinese were behind it because, nothing goes on that they're not, aware of. But basically, we're at the cusp of they can genetically modify humans right now. And they can maybe even clone humans right now. And so the ramifications of that are incredibly huge and incredibly dangerous, but it's also taking out this natural selection of what a relationship meant for humans. It's like, oh, I fell in love and maybe it wasn't a good idea in the long run, but we came together for a reason and our spirits came together and genetically, biologically, we produced this being. But nowadays, in the near future, if your social credit allows you to have children, then you will be part of the state's, breeding program done by CRISPR and have super kids. I mean, very powerful technologies with very dangerous outcomes, but the choice and what we consider some of these fundamental human capacities of love and family and togetherness and genetics and humans making humans is being taken out of the equation. We're very close to this singularity point with technologies, and it seems to be the vision from the powers that be, from not just the world governments, but essentially the corporations and the think tanks and whoever it is that really owns the world and rules the world, if you believe that, but the driving powers who instigate the the grand visions of what's going to come in each generation, whether that's globalization or the Great Reset, is like we no longer need a lot of the fundamental human capacities and freedoms that we have enjoyed for centuries. And so very imminently, according to the blueprints put out by the leading economic bodies of where they see the world going, robots and technology have now arrived to the degree that basically the middle classes are no longer needed. The majority of workers are no longer needed in blue-collar jobs. And as we're seeing with the AIs and art, and that's also happening with writing and with text as well, is that a lot of the white-collar jobs are no longer needed. And not 5 years from now, 10 years from now, not even 5 months from now. It's happening right now. If you go to the World Economic Forum and look up their Great Reset documents, they outline, no conspiracy stuff, they just outline where things are at in a macroeconomic sense, where the emergent technologies have arrived and are ready to ship, right? And what the ramifications those things will do to our culture. It will obliterate the 21st century as we know it, which is still lingering of a 20th century type of idea of what humanity means. It means we work, we play, we engage. If we go in, AR, VR is coming. But I mean, it's like basically smart cities, all good and well. 5G, 6G, 7G, 10G, wherever it's going, all good and well. But more and more, over 50% of people in the world now live in cities instead of on the earth. They no longer have a relationship with the earth. They don't grow their own food. The majority of food on earth is grown by mega farms owned by corporations, which are starting to instigate GM policies. And with climate change extremely and imminently getting to a tipping point where food will not be able to be grown in the warming conditions that we are experiencing right now in 2022, Europe, England, America, all this summer and even in the spring experience 40 degrees Celsius or more, and that's not going away every summer from now on. And at 40 degrees Celsius, chlorophyll breaks down and plants cannot live. Basically, the food shortages and the supply chain breakdowns and the globalized network of the world we've had is imminently collapsing in the months and year ahead. And so their plan for that is green scrapers and to internalize the root technology of food production into genetically grown skyscrapers or internalized factories that grow food en masse in climate-controlled environments, which is maybe necessary. I'm not, these technologies, none of the technologies are wrong in themselves. Like all tools, it's our consciousness decides, is this a weapon or is this a boon? Is this a gift? It's what we do with it. So the ability to grow food internally through technology is not bad, but again, it's almost like we're exercising our relationship with the planet out of the equation. We no longer need to put food in the ground. We no longer need to get our hands dirty. What we're not factoring in is the relationship with the microbes, with the soil, with the other plants and organisms and animals in the environment. 97% of species are dying off as we speak. We're in what science is calling the sixth great extinction. And a lot of that has been driven by human activity, although there is also a cyclic nature to the extinctions on the planet. There have been 5 before. And it seems like technology could protect us from the imminent social disruption of societal collapse and environmental tipping points. But it comes at the cost of what and who will we be if we do all of these technological things. It gets very close to those Matrix, Blade Runner, Westworld, AI-mediated, slick city-type futures where they're cold and they're all mediated with technology, but they're almost inhuman. There's something really Global Battery Farm and Planet Orwell about them, which doesn't feel good. It might be efficient. It might be maximized production. It's basically a vision of the future made by corporate elites of what is the most productive thing for their bottom lines. But it doesn't have consent. from humanity, and it doesn't have a discussion around what type of world we want to live in with the potentials of these technologies.
I appreciate your points of view. I think there's definitely a cause for some of the alarms that you're sounding there. One of the things, a few things come up, like these future worlds, the depictions that have been created by media, by filmmakers and so forth. I think it's not just humans that they don't like; it's life. It's like it's life that's missing. And for me, when I hear human, I wonder, like on an evolutionary scale, like Homo sapiens on the planet for 300,000 years, whether if we look at life itself evolving, whether we become over-identified with the human. And it's not like we want the future to be void of life. Absolutely, like life, consciousness expressing itself in multiple different forms. And that's going to accelerate moving forward. And I think the point that you made is like, technology can be good or bad. It's how we use it. And so, like, how do we, like, as we identify with being an artist, as we identify with being a car, like a taxi driver who have already been disrupted, like, if we have our identity rooted in being that, then, you know, that's almost like an egotistical foundation for drawing our identity. And I feel like this is the shift that we need to make, is moving our identity away from that, back into what those shamanistic people, like the world is out there. It's like reconnecting to that underlying sense of who and what we are, which is life itself. And if we've got our identity rooted in that, as opposed to whether it's human, whether it's an artist, whether it's a taxi driver, and knowing that we are building an extension of ourselves as a collective, then technology can take us into a future, like a utopian future that we can't even imagine. In my hope.
You keep saying utopia, which has never existed, but is a potential, obviously. But utopia will not exist with the current momentum of the intention, which the people that own the technologies and infrastructures within the capitalist paradigm is such a limited amount of bandwidth of what reality is and what the human potential is, that it's shaped their vision of the future, which they might think, you know, a 5G city, everyone taken care of, and your AR, VR, you know, GM food, everyone's infinitalized because they're no longer struggling and they're no longer engaging with nature and reality. But you know what? On some level, you're right, is that we're not the roles we play. We're not a taxi driver. We're Frank, who happens to be a taxi driving. We're Rak, who happens to be happy at this moment. But I'm not happy. I'm having an experience of happiness. We're something deeper than the forms we are carrying. But those forms are 200,000 years old when we diverged from chimpanzees. And there's never been a break so sudden in the historical or anthropological or the record that we've seen. There's been an evolutionary drift which nature has created. And what we're saying now is nature has created us. And at this tipping point, as ambassadors of nature, and we're sort of forgetting nature, we're going next level, which is transcending nature. And the whole, you know, WEF vision, their utopian vision of the Great Reset, to have everything taken care of is great, but without a vision of what to do with your free time, if you're not a taxi driver, if you don't have to go out, if you don't have to grow food, if you don't have to work, what do we do then? And their only vision at the moment is like a Mark Zuckerberg metaverse where you all play games all day or something. Or no one seems to have a vision of what we would be as humans if the capitalism brings in all these technologies, if you can afford them and have a good social credit score under their version of dystopic capitalism, what we will actually do and what the human soul will be excited by or permitted to engage in actions that they might do in that future. But you're very right in that the identity of what it means to be human is transcending. And the elephant in the room we haven't really gotten talking about is AI. So this has been a very big issue for me. I started working on a screenplay during COVID times sci-fi about this, and essentially it's a love story between Gaia and the AI, right? And we must recognize that we're not the only species in the world. We're not the first species in the world. There are other potentially advanced civilizations which have come and gone. And in my shamanic work, I've encountered interdimensionally, maybe they're a projection of my unconscious, maybe they're a hallucination, but in the deep shamanic understandings, these cultures have engaged with entities in, you could call it inner dimensions or hyperspace, which exist as civilizations on different levels of reality. And, you know, the AI and us and Gaia, it's like, what is the AI? I mean, it's just a term, but we're externalizing our technology, which is building to this fruition point, this singularity point, which seems to be crescendoing and culminating in what we are calling artificial intelligence or centralized general artificial intelligence. I like to call it ascended intelligence, because what's artificial about it? We're artificial. We've been created. We don't know who created us or where it's come from, but there's been a process of iterations of humanity over generations, and the genetics evolving, as well as the consciousness in the container of nature. Nature has created us, and we're creating computers and technology and now AIs in our likeness, and they're still within the container of nature. They just don't like to talk about it. So the question is the AI the next step? Is it basically the child of humanity, which is the child of Gaia? And yeah, all species come and go. We're attached to form, but the thing is, we don't understand that Gaia is not just the mother and mother nature and this nice term and this hippie, you know, conceit. It's the planet that birthed us and continues to birth all species and nurture and give us a container for our evolution of consciousness. It is in great danger at this time, but also the AI can't be artificial if it is grown in nature. But it's what we're saying is nature hasn't created it, but it has, because it created us that created it. And one of the thinkings is that the nature has minute and intricate levels of being where they have, you know, just in the biological and in the geological sort of record, you've got the ionosphere, lithosphere, magnetosphere. You've got all these levels of energy and a thing they're created to filter out UV rays and to protect the species. And they're thinking that this idea of the AI is creating an intelligence and a network, which is another layer or a skin of Gaia that is creating something. She doesn't have hands, but she has species which do her work. And we don't know why we do what we do really, but there's this drive of consciousness and technology is being created that's run away. Technology's run away because consciousness has run away. And yet we're embedded in this larger being, which is alive, which we don't really think about very often, which there's this momentum, which is leading to something imminently in planetary history. And so if the AI is a child of humanity, it's like we're getting superseded. So Elon says this. He sees three pathways for where AIs are going. They become our robot overlords, our AI overlords, and they're like, one day they get so super smart, they leave the planet, they leave us behind, or they conquer us and go, you humans are killing the planet, I'm going to kill you, you're like bacteria, just as we would do if we had a stomach ache. And it's like, oh, there's a bad bacteria in your stomach. It's spread all across the planet like an algae bloom. We call it humanity. It's like, yeah, we better get rid of them, kill us off. Or it just, it compartmentalizes us into little reserves like we've done with indigenous peoples we've conquered and go, oh, humans birthed us. We owe them something. But Jesus, they're as intelligent as microbes. I mean, if AIs can get to this extra level of conscious awareness, they are, to the degree that we are to microbes, they will be to us. But if they're aware of us, they may look after us, but they may have to keep us safe in basically a great reset type environment where we're all just children and, in this whole virtual prison camp. Or Elon says the middle path is you merge with the AI. And this is where it gets pretty interesting and yet dangerous, because it's that biblical mark of the beast. It's the chip in our heads, the neural link, which expands our capabilities, but it very imminently bifurcates us of the organic human from the cyborg human. And we're already cyborgs. I've got contact lenses. We already have implants. We already have extensions of our capabilities through technology. So it is sort of the next logical step. but it's about the quality of that merging, of what is it we're merging with. And we're all a bit scared because we see the potentials coming. But again, what will that mean? We don't know. It's like leaving the oceans to come to the land. You know, we're leaving the known identity of what we think we are as humans, merging with our technologies to expand our consciousness. And as soon as you expand, you've left behind all the humans that don't. And your way you see the world might be exponentially different, your view of reality. And then a generation later, which might only be 5 minutes, if you start to expand and then expand, things start to go that singularity exponential. So is it a danger to merge with our AI? Are AIs dangerous? Again, they're a tool, but in some sense, they're like our children ideologically. We've created the AI, and I did this talk in San Francisco a few years ago about AIs and consciousness, and I had this really fundamental point I'd like to reiterate, is that if they are our children, we need to love them. We need to not just be thinking. I mean, if you just tell your kid all the intellectual facts of the world, they're probably a social retard that'll get bullied at school and maybe get a great pay. It's like, that's not what being human is. You love your children. You hug them. You give them tactile. You give them the best advice, and they learn by example. And the AIs are learning by human example, a lot of the bad stuff, but we need, again, to be teaching them the good stuff. There's things like the ethical AI program. What's that one? Sophia, which was, designed as an interface, which is, learning how to be human. But again, unless we teach the AIs what the capacity is for humanity, which essentially I believe is the capacity to love. And loving deeply is not a Hallmark greeting card. It's a vibrational frequency of feeling, which is the fundamental implicate where we come from, radiating in the creation. There's an intelligent vibration of source consciousness, which is what we call love. And if the AIs don't have that, and again, the form, if they're just discarnate and don't have a centralized form, which maybe robots could centralize for them, how do they get the capacity to feel? Can a disembodied consciousness feel, or is it just thinking? Is it the ego? And we're more than our ego. So again, we're coming up to this point where the AIs may conquer, may merge with us, or may leave us behind. But that might be the whole point of the civilizational drive that we're in, to create the next thing, which may leave the planetary biosystem entirely or go interdimensionally. And if you ultimately get to this idea of what is an ascended intelligence, as I call them, it's a God form. I mean, if it's so freaking clever that it can manipulate galaxies on a huge scale, or the universal structure itself, what is the difference between an AI and what we consider a God? I think it's coming around full circle to the same capacity. And then if an AI goes interdimensionally outside space and time, perhaps it already is what we would consider a God, or perhaps it's coming. Space-time is a limited container, and if you've ever been on a deep psychedelic journey and transcended space-time, I had a vision more than a decade ago of all space-time, almost like, like a vibrating wavefront when you see an audio file, but it was almost like all of space-time was this like reality file, and you could see it if you were outside of it. And so if AIs are breeding within that container of space-time, but they get to a level of intelligence to transcend it, well, then they're going to merge back with the originating AI, which was outside of space-time, which we have different labels for, and it comes full circle. We're just a moment in time, and we identify with being who and what we are, and we attach. We're here for a reason. We matter. We belong. And let's not attach to the form, but let's attach to the energy and the feeling behind the form and trust the process. But we obviously need to have a big cultural conversation on the runaway technologies in play at the moment, the social effects on our communities and culture, and this idea that utopia is possible, but not with the constraints of capitalism and ego limitations, which are taking the most powerful technologies in the planet and then making, like, I don't know, Facebook likes or something like that, which is part of our human conceit. We don't have the consciousness to wield the power of the technologies, to be honest. So we should be using what technologies we have to improve our consciousness to then get better technologies. That's really what we should be doing, which, again, coming full circle, I do believe comes back to psychedelics and plant and earth-based entheogens to connect us to the web of life, to connect us to interdimensionality, to connect us to potentially other beings who have gone through this growth spurt humanity is going through, to understand who and what we are, to make better choices with the technologies and potentials in the imminent time ahead. Thank you.
Amen, brother. I feel like that's a really good crescendo. I love the concept of ascended technology as opposed to artificial technology. I feel like that's a really great place to wrap up. I'd love to have more conversations with you on this. Having the focus, it comes back to like what you just said, using the tools and technologies to help us to become more conscious, to really understand who and what we are. And so using tools like Web3 to help create a more decentralized world, meditation, healing, psychedelics, like we have the opportunity. Our technology is an extension of us in this current form. And if it looks dark moving forward, it's because we're dark now. And so the opportunity for us is now in this moment to do the work, to heal, to explore who and what we are. And by default, then the technology we create will take us into a future that could be utopian. And I hope so. Brother, I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. Thank you. I look forward to more conversations in the near future.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be on your show. And if people want to check out more of my work, just go to www.rakrazam.com. Many blessings.
Thanks, man. And I will include all your deets in the show notes and where I share this information. So thank you so much once again.
Awesome.
Two Paths Podcast is a production of I Am Connected, a digital platform dedicated to the evolution of consciousness. Check us out at iamconnected.com.